If your watercolor paintings are lacking depth and distance, then look no further. In this video, I'm going to go through a simple way that you can make your paintings stand out. Hey everybody, my name is Kirsty and my aim is to help you improve your art so that you have the skills and confidence you need to pursue a career doing what you love. And a big struggle that beginners have with watercolors is creating depth, especially in landscapes. So how do you stop your paintings from looking flat? To do this, you need to create the illusion of depth and distance. And there are many ways that you can go about doing this, but for this video, I'm going to go through one simple concept that will help you create that depth fast. I am going to demonstrate this technique with a landscape painting because this is the best subject matter to show you how this concept works, because it has loads of different elements like trees and paths. How do we exactly go about creating the illusion that there are some mountains really far off in the distance and there's a tree line in the distance, but then also some trees close up? How do we show that in a painting? How do we create that distance and give that depth? Let's go through it. The way that you create the illusion of depth and distance in your painting is by varying your values. And your values are basically how light or dark your colors and shades are. To make this simple, I'm going to demonstrate this technique using only one color, and I'll be diluting that one watercolor with varying amounts of water in order to get the different values. And creating monochrome paintings are a great way to practice adding depth to your artwork, because you have no longer got to worry about picking the perfect colors. You are purely focusing on adding the right values. When creating your paintings, I want you to remember this one principle, and this is the most important thing that I want you to take away from this whole video, and that is the elements furthest in the distance will appear the lightest, and objects up close will appear darker and darker as they get closer to the foreground. And now this is what I'll be focusing on showing you in today's video. A couple of other things to consider when creating depth in your paintings is, number one, the size of the objects. So the mountains in the distance are going to appear smaller than if you have a mountain really up close. So think about what size your objects will be depending on how close or far away they are. The further something is away, the smaller it will appear. So if you have a tree really far away, it's going to look smaller than a tree up close. So vary the size of the elements in your painting depending on how close or far away they are. And number two is the clarity of that object. So if you have something really far in the distance, it is going to be more blurry and out of focus than something really close up. So the objects right in the foreground of the painting are going to need a lot more detail added to them than anything in the distance. Anything in the distance you'll want to be out of focus and quite blurry looking. Now let's get into the demonstration, and I'm going to be painting a lovely woods and animal silhouette. So the first step I'll be taking is painting the background, and I'm going to use the wet and wet technique for this. So this is basically where you wet the paper first with clean water and then add your watercolor wash on top. In the reference, you can see that the background should be lightest in the center and get slightly darker at the edges and corners. With our first layer, we should be painting the objects furthest in the background. And with each layer, you are going to be painting objects that are getting closer and closer to the foreground. As the first wash of color should be the lightest, you need to add lots of water to dilute the paint. After the first layer has dried, it is time to start painting in the trees, and this is the really fun part. So as you can see in the reference, the trees are in rows. We start off by painting the trees furthest in the distance. You can add a bit more paint to your previous wash to make it slightly darker, But you still want it to be light because we are painting the trees right in the back, and we are painting the back row of trees, and so these need to be really light, because remember, the objects furthest in the distance appear the lightest, and then they get darker and darker as you get towards the front. Remember, that is the principle that I want you to remember and take away from today's video. A great technique that I like to use is tissue, and I use this to pull up some of the colour in areas where the sunlight is shining through the tree line. So in this reference, the trees are slightly darker at the bottom and they get lighter at the top because the top is getting access to more light. You want to make this first row of trees so light that it is barely visible. As these trees are really far in the distance, you won't be able to see much detail like individual leaves, so don't go adding too much detail at this point. You're just basically painting in the shape of the tree trunks, but with these distant rows of trees, you are not getting in any details because we want them to have a blurry, out of focus look. Before you move on to the second row of trees, make sure that you wait for the first row to dry so that the colours don't bleed into each other and make a mess. But once it has dried, let's go in and paint our second row of trees. And we need these trees to be slightly darker, so once again go in and add a bit more paint to that mixed up wash that you created so that it gets slightly darker and is a slightly darker value. And at this point, we still can't see a lot of detail in this next row of trees. It's still very far in the distance, so we don't need to add a lot of detail like leaves just yet. Now, when you're painting these tree trunks, try not to paint them too straight. They'll look a lot more realistic if you add some curves to the trunks, and also add a variety of thicknesses to the trunks just to make them a bit more interesting so that they're not all uniformed. Once again, give each row of trees time to dry before moving on to the next row. As you start to paint in the front row of trees, you will want to add in more detail, like thin branches and individual leaves. Varying the amount of detail you include for each layer really helps to give the illusion of distance. Also, make sure to increase the depth by painting in these front trees darker than your previous rows by once again mixing in a bit more paint into your wash of colour that you've made up. As these trees are closer, they are also going to appear bigger, so their trunks will be thicker than the trees that are further away. Because remember, we said that the size varies depending on how far away or close the elements are in our painting. Make sure that when you're painting in these thin branches that you switch to a smaller paintbrush. The branches will be getting thinner and thinner the more times they split off, so you don't want to use a really big paintbrush for this, otherwise you won't be able to get in all of those tiny details. Also, a great trick that I like to do to get a really realistic leaf texture is to use a sponge, and I just use a section of an old washing up sponge, and I dip the sponge into my paint, squeeze out any excess, and I just start tapping that sponge onto the paper. And this is a really effective and easy way to create the impression of leaves. Finally, I'm going to finish off this painting by painting the animals and ground, which is the closest animals in the foreground. And therefore, because they are the closest and the objects that are furthest towards the front, we want to make these the darkest values in the whole painting. So therefore, we want to mix up the paint with hardly any water in it at all to get the silhouettes really dark. And because it is a silhouette, you can go in and add a bit of black to your mixed up paint so that it can get as dark as it needs to get. You basically only really need to add enough water to get the paint to easily flow onto the paper. And once again, as we are painting the foreground, we do need to add in details. So look to see if there are any individual blades of grass in the ground that you could paint in, or any bits of fur that you can see for the animal silhouette. These little things are what is going to make a big difference to your finished painting. And as you can see, this method has allowed us to create a landscape that has a lot of depth and contrast, simply by using a variety of different values and by working in layers. So this is one way that you can solve the problem of having really flat watercolor paintings. Now, there are many other struggles that beginners go through with watercolors. For example, 3 big ones that I always hear all of the time is 1, how do I stop my watercolors from running and bleeding into each other and making a complete mess? How do I control them? The second one that I always hear is, why am I getting harsh edges? I just want to get a really nice smooth wash of color, but it's just not happening. And 3, where do I start with watercolors? If you are asking any of these questions, then the next step for you is to get my free watercolor tutorial for beginners. It is a 2-hour real-time painting demonstration that you can follow along with and learn all of the techniques that you need to create amazing, expressive watercolor paintings and improve your watercolor skills. So I'll leave a link to that at the top of the description, or you can get it by clicking here, and it's just a really fun, relaxing project that you can have a go at and build confidence with your watercolors. So check it out, and I will see you guys in the next video.